Mayfair, London. The automatic gates of the most exclusive mansion on Grosvenor Square open for Victoria Blackwood's silver Rolls-Royce, the property mogul worth £5 billion. A dirty, desperate 10-year-old girl throws herself in front of the car, screaming impossible warnings. "Your husband has cut the brakes. There's a deadly turn on the M25. You'll die in 20 minutes. The billionaire laughs at the absurdity. But when the child cries that she's her daughter, the daughter abandoned 10 years ago, and names Thomas Mitchell, a ghost from the past, Victoria instinctively presses the brake. The pedal sinks into nothing. In that moment, she understands. The homeless child speaks the truth. And she has only 30 seconds to decide whether to trust the daughter she never. The morning of November 15th gleamed with that crystalline light only London offers in autumn. Victoria Blackwood, 51 years of arrogance condensed into a £10,000 Chanel suit, crossed the hall of her Mayfair mansion with the confidence of someone who owned half of Canary Wharf. Her Louboutin heels echoed on the Italian marble as she passed the Turners and Constables, investments worth entire council estates in Hackney or Brixton. James, her husband, was on the glass terrace, perfect in his Savile Row robe, his silver hair catching the morning sun. 48 years carried with the artificial grace of one who frequents Harley Street's finest clinics. He raised his hand in what seemed an affectionate greeting as she headed toward the garage. The kiss on the cheek they exchanged had the temperature of the marble beneath their feet, a formality performed for the staff and security cameras. The silver Rolls-Royce Phantom awaited, gleaming like liquid mercury, the latest jewel in a collection that included vintage Aston Martins and McLarens never driven. Victoria loved this morning ritual, the purr of the V12 engine, the scent of English leather, the feeling of absolute power as the automatic gates opened onto the London she dominated from her glass towers. That's when the girl appeared. She materialized from nothing like a stain of dirty reality on the perfect canvas of the mansion. 10 years old, perhaps 11, clothes telling stories of nights spent in cardboard boxes under Thames bridges, hair matted and filthy that hadn't seen shampoo in months. But it was the eyes that struck, an intense green that burned with feverish desperation in the face hollowed by hunger. The girl literally threw herself in front of the Rolls-Royce, her small hands beating on the immaculate bonnet, leaving prints of dirt that would be, Victoria couldn't know, the last intact thing she'd see of her car. Her scream cut through the morning air with a primal urgency that made even the Polish gardener pruning roses turn around. Victoria lowered the electric window with aristocratic annoyance, already mentally preparing the reprimand for the head of security for this unforgivable breach in the system. But the girl's words froze her like liquid nitrogen in her veins. The child spoke of cut brakes, of a specific turn on the M25, junction 15 after the service station, where the car would plunge 50 feet into the concrete barrier. She spoke of the bribed mechanic at the dealership, of the chauffeur who'd called in sick that very morning, of a plan orchestrated down to the smallest detail. Victoria laughed, a fat, arrogant laugh of someone used to buying and selling human destinies like development properties. But then, the girl pronounced the name that changed everything. Thomas Mitchell. Victoria's blood turned to ice. Thomas Mitchell was a ghost buried 10 years ago under mountains of voluntary forgetfulness and dormant guilt. The accountant from Tower Hamlets, with a first from Cambridge and green eyes like emeralds, whom she'd seduced out of boredom during a late audit night, used for months as secret entertainment, then eliminated from her life when the pregnancy threatened to complicate her golden existence. The girl kept talking, each word a nail in the coffin of Victoria's certainties. Her name was Emma. She was the daughter Victoria had declared stillborn by bribing the head of obstetrics at Guy's Hospital. Thomas had killed himself jumping from Tower Bridge when she was 3 months old, after Victoria had him fired with false embezzlement accusations, preventing him from finding work anywhere in London with her network of influences. Victoria felt her hand move instinctively toward the brake pedal. She pressed it lightly, almost to verify the absurdity of these accusations. The pedal sank into emptiness like her certainties. Terror exploded in her chest like a bomb. She raised her eyes to the terrace. James was still there, the perfect smile that now seemed like that of a black widow spider. Beside him, she noticed for the first time, stood Marcus, the head of security, also smiling. A complicit smile Victoria had seen 1,000 times in the business world when someone was about to be stabbed in the back. The girl, Emma, her daughter, the thought was impossible to process, pointed urgently at the black Bentley parked 50 yards away. Sir Charles Pemberton, the solicitor who managed all of Victoria's affairs, was at the wheel, phone to his ear. James's lover, Emma revealed, who'd been planning this moment with him for 3 years. They'd already prepared false documents, bought witnesses, a reconstruction of the accident that would leave no doubt. Tragic fatality. Inconsolable widower who inherits everything. New marriage after the proper mourning. Victoria looked at this girl claiming to be her daughter. She saw her own green eyes in a face that had Thomas's delicate features, the same mouth, the same way of tilting her head. The genetic mathematics were undeniable. But more than DNA, it was the look that convinced her. There was no hatred in those eyes, only a desperate urgency to save the mother she'd never had. The Rolls-Royce engine purred, 400,000 pounds of British engineering transformed into a death trap. Victoria had seconds to decide. She could ignore the warning, drive toward the fate James had prepared, die in the certainty of her convictions. Or she could believe this impossible savior emerged from nothing, this ghost daughter who'd chosen salvation over revenge. She turned off the engine. The moment she got out of the car, she heard the metallic click under the Rolls-Royce. Emma heard it too, and dragged Victoria away with surprising strength for a 10-year-old. The explosion that followed 3 seconds later transformed the Rolls-Royce into a fireball that shattered the ground-floor windows. If she'd stayed in the car, there would have been nothing left to identify. James screamed from the terrace, but it wasn't a cry of fear for his nearly killed wife. It was pure rage, frustration over a failed plan. Marcus was already drawing his gun, but hesitated. Shooting in broad daylight in Mayfair with dozens of cameras and witnesses wasn't planned. Charles got out of the Bentley, his face a mask of panic as he frantically dialed numbers on his phone, probably calling accomplices for Plan B. Emma grabbed Victoria's arm and ran. Not toward Grosvenor Square, where Charles could intercept them, but toward Hyde Park, through a gap in the fence only someone living on the streets could know. They ran among the ancient oaks, while behind them rose sirens and shouts. Victoria, used to the gym with a personal trainer, but not to real flight, felt her lungs burn and her legs weaken. Emma, however, moved with the agility of an urban animal, knowing every path, every hiding place. They only stopped after 20 minutes, hidden in an abandoned groundskeeper's shed. Victoria gasped, the Chanel suit ruined, the Louboutin heels scratched and dirty. For the first time in decades, she had no control over anything. She looked at this girl claiming to be her daughter, who'd just saved her from certain death, and saw Thomas Mitchell looking at her through those identical green eyes. The shed stank of mold and abandonment, cobwebs in the corners and rusty tools piled like bones in an ossuary. Victoria Blackwood, the woman who habitually lunched with prime ministers and archbishops, sat on a rotten wooden crate, while her daughter, the thought still seemed impossible, watched through the loose boards. Emma told her story in a flat voice, without dramatic emphasis, like someone who'd learned that emotion is a luxury the street doesn't grant. She'd grown up in St. Catherine's orphanage until age 7, when a dying nun revealed the truth about her birth and gave her the letter Thomas had left, a letter that spoke of love for a woman who'd betrayed him, of hope that one day mother and daughter would find each other, of forgiveness even in despair. Escaped from the orphanage, she'd lived on London streets, sleeping under bridges in summer and in tube stations in winter. She'd learned to survive by stealing from tourists at Piccadilly Circus, sharing expired food behind Tesco stores with other invisible people of the city. But most of all, she'd spent years looking for Victoria Blackwood, studying her like an entomologist studies a rare insect. She knew every property of Victoria's, every habit, every secret whispered in the corridors of power. She knew about the dirty deals with Albanian gangs for the lands in Stratford, the bribes to council officials for planning permissions, the suicides caused by evictions during the crisis. But most importantly, for a year she'd lived in the shadow of the Mayfair mansion, sleeping in park bins, watching the golden life that unfolded behind the gates. That's how she'd discovered James's plan. The phone conversations in the garden when he thought he was alone, the meetings with Charles every Tuesday and Thursday when Victoria thought they were at the club, and the accountants. She'd seen cash change hands to the dealership mechanic. She'd heard Marcus, the security chief, confirm his part in the plan.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Victoria listened, feeling her world crumble brick by brick. Not only had they tried to kill her, but she'd been betrayed by everyone she thought was hers. The man who'd slept in her bed for 15 years, the friend solicitor who managed her business, the security chief she paid handsomely, all actors in a play where she was the only one who didn't know the script. Victoria's phone vibrated. Messages from banks. All accounts frozen for suspicious activity. Credit cards cancelled. Investment funds frozen. James had moved fast, using the powers of attorney she'd signed over the years without reading. In minutes, she'd gone from billionaire to pauper. Emma watched the mother she'd never had as she realized the magnitude of the disaster. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only a strange pity. She'd saved this woman not out of filial love. How can you love someone who denied your existence? But out of a twisted sense of justice. Victoria deserved to know the truth before losing everything. She deserved to see the face of the daughter she'd erased. They stayed in the shed until dusk, while outside the police combed the park. But it wasn't the real police, Emma knew. They were James's men in uniform, bought like everything else. When night fell, they moved through the invisible London that Emma knew like her pockets. Abandoned tube tunnels, passages between buildings that the homeless passed down, routes that existed only for those who didn't exist in society's eyes. They arrived under Waterloo Bridge when the city slept. The community of invisible people living there welcomed Emma with the familiarity of those who share the same sentence. Victoria, in her destroyed Chanel suit, looked like an alien fallen from another planet. They gave her cardboard to sleep on, an army blanket stolen from who knows where, a piece of stale bread that tasted of mold. For the first time in 51 years, Victoria Blackwood slept on bare earth, with the cold of the Thames penetrating her bones and the sound of rats running in the darkness. Beside her, 10-year-old Emma slept peacefully, accustomed. On the other side, a university professor reduced to alcoholism recited Shakespeare in his sleep, while an elderly prostitute coughed blood in a corner. The following days were a brutal education in survival. Emma guided Victoria through the bowels of London that tourists and the rich never saw. The soup kitchens at St. Martin's where former executives served soup to former workers, all leveled by the same misery. The makeshift dormitories in abandoned stations, where hierarchies were based on violence and not bank accounts. The black markets for fake documents, expired food, stolen medicines. Victoria learned to rummage through bins at 4 in the morning, before the rubbish trucks passed. She learned to distinguish edible food from poisonous, to sleep with one eye open to avoid being robbed. to make herself invisible when patrols passed. But most of all, she learned to see the faces of those she'd ruined. The woman who gave her a crust of bread at the soup kitchen was an employee she'd fired to cut costs. The man who showed her where to find clean water was a bricklayer left without compensation when one of her companies strategically went bankrupt. The boy who protected her from an assault was the son of a shopkeeper who'd committed suicide over debts to the loan sharks Victoria used as unofficial collectors. Father Michael, the street priest who ran a shelter in a deconsecrated church in Whitechapel, recognized her immediately. 70 years of wrinkles carved by social struggle. Eyes that had seen too much to have illusions anymore. He looked at her for a long time, then looked at Emma, then made a decision that surprised everyone. He would help, but on 3 conditions. Work at the soup kitchen to atone, public confession when the time came, recognition of Emma with all that implied. Victoria accepted. She had no alternative, but most of all, looking at Emma, who'd saved her despite everything, she felt something she thought had been dead for decades. Remorse. True, burning remorse for the lives destroyed, for Thomas abandoned, for the daughter denied. Meanwhile, outside, the world kept turning. The newspapers talked about Victoria Blackwood's kidnapping. James appeared on television, perfect tears rolling over his Botox, begging the kidnappers to return his wife. Charles beside him, the concerned family friend. A performance that would deserve a BAFTA if it weren't so tragically real. But Emma had an ace up her sleeve. In her years on the street, she'd met Rashid, not the corrupt security chief, but another Rashid, a 19-year-old hacker who lived off computer fraud. In exchange for protection from Romanian gangs, Rashid had started tracking every digital movement of James and Charles. He had everything. Transfers to the Cayman Islands, WhatsApp chats about the murder plan, even video of the mechanic cutting the brakes. 2 weeks later, James made his final move. He declared Victoria legally dead through emergency procedure, bribing judges and producing false testimonies. Charles became administrator of the estate. Assets began to be liquidated at ridiculous prices to shell companies with nominees. The moment of truth arrived on December 5th. James had organized a press conference at the Tate Modern to announce the creation of the Victoria Blackwood Foundation, a front operation to launder the stolen money. All of London's elite would be present. Victoria entered through the main door, unrecognizable after weeks on the street. Unkempt appearance, charity shop clothes, but above all different eyes. No longer the predator's arrogance, but the survivor's awareness. The silence was sepulchral when she took the microphone. The confession that followed went down in history. Not only did she reveal the attempted murder with evidence projected on the giant screen thanks to hacker Rashid, but she confessed all her crimes. Names, dates, figures. Total public self-destruction. She announced that every property would be returned to the victims and that Emma, her finally recognized daughter, would manage the redistribution. James was arrested live. Charles tried to flee but was stopped. The House of Cards collapsed in minutes. The Blackwood Empire dissolved, but from its ashes something different began to be born. The trial was swift and merciless. James got 30 years, Charles 25. Victoria, for her total cooperation, 5 years of community service. But the real sentence was living with what she'd done, facing it every day. Mother and daughter moved to a 2-bedroom flat in Tower Hamlets, in the same building where Thomas had lived. Victoria worked 18 hours a day between the soup kitchen and Father Michael's construction sites. The hands that had signed billion-pound contracts now cleaned toilets and mixed cement. Emma returned to school, making up lost years with a voracious hunger for knowledge. In the evenings they dined together, beans on toast, talking about Thomas, the past, the future. Slowly, painfully, they built something that resembled a mother-daughter relationship. A forgotten property of Victoria's turned out to contain Tudor artifacts worth $30 million. Emma, now legal heir, didn't hesitate. The Thomas Mitchell Center for Homeless Children was born. 800 young people found home, education, hope. Victoria became its caretaker, cleaning bathrooms with the same meticulousness she'd once signed billion-pound deals. 5 years later, Emma graduated from Cambridge with first-class honors, like her father. Victoria sat in the front row, aged but finally at peace. The Thomas Mitchell Center had become a national model, saving thousands of children. Emma married Oliver, son of a family Victoria had evicted years before. The circle of revenge transformed into a spiral of forgiveness. A daughter was born. They named her Hope. Victoria held her in her arms in the same hospital where Emma had been born, where Thomas had died alone. This time, it would be different. 10 years after the attempted murder, Victoria still cleaned the center's toilets, by choice, as a form of meditation and penance. One morning, she found a new girl crying hidden. Similar story. Rich mother who'd abandoned her. Father's suicide. Victoria sat beside her on the freshly cleaned floor and told her story. The girl looked at her incredulously, then extended her hand. Victoria shook it. Another life saved. Another circle closing to reopen differently. Somewhere, in an afterlife Victoria had learned to believe in, Thomas Mitchell smiled. The monster he'd loved had become human. The abandoned daughter had become savior. Pain had transformed into redemption. It all started with a 10-year-old homeless girl screaming in front of golden gates. Sometimes, salvation comes from where you least expect it. Sometimes daughters save mothers they never had. Sometimes, only sometimes, even monsters learn what it means to be human. The Thomas Mitchell Center continues to save lives. On the entrance wall, a plaque bears the words Emma said to Victoria that first morning, "Even monsters deserve to know the truth before they die." And sometimes, knowing the truth, they choose to truly live for the first time. If you've made it this far, you understand that no one is beyond redemption. That blood creates bonds that even abandonment cannot break. That losing everything may be the only way to find yourself. Leave a like if you believe second chances exist, even for those who don't deserve them. Share this story with those who think destiny is written in stone. And remember, when life puts truth in front of you, even if it comes from the mouth of a desperate homeless child screaming, listen. It might be the only chance for salvation you'll have.